In front of hundreds of wealthy guests in Palo Alto, Marcus Sterling lifted his glass, pointed at his wife, and laughed, as if she were the punchline to a joke only he was rich enough to tell. He was a famous technology CEO, the kind of man investors chased across hotel lobbies and magazine editors described as visionary. Elena stood beside him in a silver dress, quiet, graceful, and still. Then Marcus said that if he divorced her, she would be begging for a cleaning job within a week. The room froze for a moment before a few people forced out nervous laughter. Marcus smiled, pleased with himself. He thought he had humiliated her. He thought he had reminded everyone who held the power. But 20 minutes later, Elena walked back down the staircase with 2 suitcases, a sealed envelope, and a secret she had been preparing for years. Marcus did not understand silence. That was his first mistake. He thought silence meant agreement. He thought patience meant weakness. He thought a woman who did not defend herself in public had nothing to defend. For years he had mistaken Elena's calm face for surrender, her careful smile for dependence, and her quiet exits from crowded rooms for proof that she could not survive outside his shadow. He had no idea that every insult he threw at her had become another line in a private ledger. Not a ledger of revenge, exactly, but of evidence. Evidence that the life they had built together was no longer a marriage. Evidence that the man who once promised to protect her dignity now enjoyed stripping it away in front of strangers. And evidence that when she finally left, she would not leave in panic. She would leave ready. In Palo Alto, Marcus Sterling was treated like a man who had already become the future. His company, Sterling Systems, built enterprise security software for banks, hospitals, logistics companies, and government contractors. He spoke at conferences under bright stage lights, accepted awards beside governors and venture capitalists, and moved through the Bay Area with the relaxed arrogance of someone who had grown used to people opening doors before he reached for the handle. His face appeared on business magazines. His opinions were quoted in articles about artificial intelligence and cybersecurity, and young founders repeated his phrases as if success could be borrowed through imitation. Marcus had built a public image so polished that even his cruelty looked to careless people like confidence. Elena was part of that image. She was beautiful, composed, and elegant in the way wealthy circles liked women to be elegant, visible, supportive, and never disruptive. She knew which donors had recently lost a parent, which investor's child had started college, which board member preferred not to be seated near, which rival and which quiet employee at Marcus's company deserved a thank you note after saving a product launch. She remembered birthdays, smoothed over offenses, softened Marcus's sharp edges, and turned cold rooms into places where deals could happen. At events, people often told Marcus he was lucky to have her, but they usually meant it in the shallow way people praised a man for owning something beautiful. Marcus accepted the compliment that way too. What almost no one remembered was that Elena had once been more than the woman standing beside him. Before she became Mrs. Sterling in the public imagination, she had been Elena Vance, a systems consultant with a mind for messy problems. She understood infrastructure contracts, data migration, and the quiet pressure points where companies broke when they grew too fast. She had met Marcus before Sterling Systems became famous, back when his company was still operating out of a cramped office where the air conditioning failed during investor meetings and engineers slept under their desks before product deadlines. He had been brilliant then, or at least brilliant in flashes. He could sell a vision better than anyone Elena had ever met, but his vision had holes in it. Elena saw the holes. More importantly, she knew how to patch them. In those early years, Marcus admired her because he needed her. He listened when she explained why a client's data architecture would collapse under scale. He laughed when she teased him for promising features his engineers had not built yet. He asked her to review decks before investor calls, and when she found weaknesses, he would sit beside her late into the night, taking notes with the intensity of a man who still knew he did not know everything. Those were the years Elena remembered whenever she tried to explain to herself why she stayed so long after the kindness disappeared. Marcus had not always mocked her. At one time he had looked at her as if her intelligence was a gift. At one time he had said he trusted her more than anyone. But success changed the temperature of his admiration. The more powerful Marcus became, the less he could tolerate needing anyone. He began rewriting their history in subtle ways. Her advice became his instinct. Her warnings became his strategic caution. Her late-night fixes became his leadership under pressure. When Sterling Systems landed its first 8-figure contract, Marcus thanked his investors, his engineers, and his own relentless vision. He did not mention that Elena had spent 3 weeks rebuilding the implementation plan after discovering the original timeline was impossible. At the after-party, when someone praised how smoothly the deal had closed, Marcus wrapped an arm around Elena's waist and said she had kept the coffee coming. Everyone laughed. Elena smiled because she did not yet know how often she would be asked to smile at the erasure of her own work. After they married, the jokes sharpened. At first, Marcus framed them as affection. He told friends Elena was too good-hearted to understand business politics. He said she had retired into beauty, as if her mind had become unnecessary once his bank account grew large enough. He made comments about her being terrible with technology, even though she had once corrected his engineer's deployment plan while eating dinner from a takeout carton. If Elena pushed back in private, Marcus accused her of being sensitive. If she withdrew, he accused her of making him look bad. Eventually, she learned that any defense became another opportunity for him to perform dominance. So she stopped defending herself in front of other people. Marcus took that as proof that he had won. The cruelest part was not only what Marcus said, it was how carefully he chose his stage. He rarely insulted Elena when they were alone with no audience. Alone, he could be cold, dismissive, impatient, and controlling, but his real pleasure came when people watched. At charity dinners, investor retreats, museum openings, and private wine tastings, he found little ways to make her smaller. If a conversation turned toward cybersecurity, he would glance at Elena and say, "She probably thought the cloud was something that ruined her hair." If someone mentioned a new software platform, he would joke that without him, Elena would not know how to change the Wi-Fi password. The words were always delivered with a smile, always light enough for people to pretend they were harmless, always sharp enough to leave a mark. People laughed because Marcus was powerful, and power can make cowardice look like politeness. Some laughed loudly because they wanted his approval. Some laughed softly because they were uncomfortable. Some did not laugh at all, but said nothing, which hurt Elena in a different way. She learned to read every kind of silence in those rooms. The eager silence of people waiting to see if Marcus would continue. The guilty silence of women who recognized the humiliation, but had learned not to challenge men like him at dinner tables. The strategic silence of investors who did not want domestic cruelty to complicate a profitable relationship. Elena noticed everything. Marcus, convinced that she noticed nothing, kept giving her material. At home, the mansion in Palo Alto looked like a reward. It had glass walls, stone terraces, a wine room, a pool that reflected the moon, and a staircase that curved down into the main foyer, like something designed for entrances. Designers had arranged the furniture so every room felt expensive, but strangely unlivable. Marcus loved the house because it impressed visitors. Elena often felt loneliest inside it. Her closet was full of dresses chosen for events she did not enjoy. Her calendar was packed with appearances that made Marcus seem grounded, charitable, and happily married. Her name was on invitations, but her life was not her own. Even the staff moved around Marcus's moods, as if the house itself were wired to his ego. The first time Elena seriously thought about leaving, Marcus had mocked her in front of a young founder who had come to dinner hoping for mentorship. The founder, a woman named Priya, had asked Elena a sincere question about scaling operations after a major client win. Elena began to answer from experience, carefully explaining how early technical debt could become a silent tax on growth. Marcus interrupted before she finished. He told Priya that Elena's real expertise was choosing flowers for the table, and that if Priya wanted business advice, she should ask someone who had actually built something. The young founder looked embarrassed. Elena felt heat rise to her face, not because Marcus had insulted her, but because he had made another woman participate in the insult. That night, after the guests left, Elena took off her earrings, sat alone in the bathroom, and realized she no longer wanted an apology. She wanted a plan. The plan began quietly, almost modestly. Elena did not storm out. She did not threaten divorce. She did not announce that she was rebuilding herself. She started with documents. She requested old tax records reviewed, the prenuptial agreement Marcus had insisted on before the wedding, and discovered something that would later become important. Marcus had been so determined to protect his own assets that the agreement also protected any separate assets Elena created without using marital funds. He had treated the document as a cage. In time, it would become one of the locks he could not open. She opened a private account under her maiden name, Elena Vance, using consulting income from small projects she accepted through professional contacts Marcus had forgotten she still had. At first, the work was small enough to hide inside exhaustion. A nonprofit needed help migrating donor records without losing years of messy data. A medical billing startup needed someone to identify why its internal tool kept failing under load. A regional logistics company needed an outside consultant to translate between executives and engineers who had stopped trusting each other. Elena took the calls late at night or early in the morning. She did not use Marcus's money. She did not use his staff. She did not use his company's proprietary information. She used the one thing Marcus had spent years pretending she did not have: her own mind. Her schedule became almost inhuman, but it gave her back a piece of herself. Marcus often came home after dinners, panels, or private meetings, smelling of expensive wine and self-congratulation. He would drop his jacket over a chair, complain about people who bored him, and fall asleep within minutes. Elena waited until the house settled. Then, between 2 and 5 in the morning, she slipped into a small room at the back of the house that Marcus called the storage room because he never noticed what mattered in it. Inside was an old wooden desk, a lamp, a second-hand monitor, and a laptop Marcus had once laughed at for being outdated. On that laptop, Elena built Vance Tech Solutions, one contract at a time. There was no dramatic music in those nights. There was only discipline. Elena answered emails while the rest of the house slept. She wrote proposals with one ear tuned for Marcus's footsteps. She took calls with clients in Europe before sunrise, her voice low, her notes precise. She learned which types of projects produced steady revenue and which clients drained time without respecting boundaries. She hired a part-time accountant, then a contract attorney, then 2 remote developers she paid before paying herself. She made mistakes, corrected them, and kept going. Some mornings, she stood in front of the mirror after 3 hours of sleep, applying makeup for another charity breakfast, where Marcus would joke that she had no idea how hard he worked. She would smile, and inside that smile, she would remember the invoice she had sent at 4:17 a.m. As Vance Tech Solutions grew, Elena built the company around everything Marcus lacked. Marcus sold certainty, even when he had not earned it. Elena sold clarity. Marcus intimidated people into agreement. Elena listened until the real problem surfaced. Marcus chased headlines. Elena chased clean implementation, documented promises, and systems that did not collapse the moment a charismatic person left the room. Clients returned because she did not make them feel foolish for being confused. Engineers trusted her because she did not throw them under the bus to impress executives. Executives trusted her because she did not decorate bad news. She could walk into a tense meeting and make the problem smaller simply by naming it accurately. The money came slowly at first, then steadily, then faster than Elena expected. She kept most of it inside the company. She paid taxes cleanly, kept records obsessively, and refused anything that could later be twisted into dependence on Marcus. When she bought her first small rental property through a separate entity, she signed the documents with a hand that trembled after she left the office. Not because she was afraid, but because ownership felt unfamiliar after years of being treated like an accessory. Later came a second property, then a cautious investment portfolio, then a lease on a small office space in San Francisco that she told herself she would use only when the time was right. Every practical step became a quiet sentence in a language Marcus could not read. There were clues, of course. There are always clues when someone underestimates the person beside them. Marcus saw packages arrive under the name E. Vance and assumed they were beauty products. He heard Elena take an early call and later mocked her for joining a wellness group. He noticed her old laptop open one night and joked that she was probably shopping for throw pillows. Once, at a dinner with a healthcare executive, the executive praised a boutique consulting firm called Vance Tech Solutions for rescuing a delayed integration. Elena lowered her eyes to her plate. Marcus waved it off and said small firms were useful for small minds and small problems. The executive looked uncomfortable because the project had saved his company millions. Elena said nothing. She did not need Marcus to recognize her. Recognition was not the same thing as freedom. What made Elena's patience difficult was that she still remembered the man Marcus had been before applause became his addiction. That memory did not excuse him, but it complicated the leaving. Abuse is not always a door that slams once. Sometimes it is a room that grows colder by degrees until the person inside realizes they have been shivering for years. Marcus could still be charming when he wanted something. He could still send flowers after going too far, though the notes were never true apologies. He could still stand beside her at public events and place a hand at the small of her back in a way that looked tender in photographs. People saw the pictures and called them a power couple. Elena saw the pictures and wondered how many women had learned to disappear while standing in the center of the frame. By the 4th year of their marriage, Marcus had become almost careless with his contempt. He no longer bothered to hide that he saw Elena as part of his branding. When stylists arrived before major events, he approved her dress the way he approved lighting for a stage. When assistants prepared seating charts, he checked whether Elena would be close enough to soften his image, but not close enough to speak too much. If she offered an opinion about a guest, a donor, or a potential client, he listened only when it benefited him, then later repeated the insight as his own. Elena stopped expecting gratitude. She began measuring time differently, not in birthdays or anniversaries, but in milestones. Company registration complete. First, 6-figure contract signed. Separate tax filings reviewed. Emergency fund secured. Penthouse lease prepared. Divorce attorney retained. The penthouse was not extravagant in the way Marcus understood extravagance. It was beautiful, yes, high above San Francisco, with wide windows and a view that shifted from fog to gold depending on the hour. But to Elena, its luxury was not the marble island or the quiet elevator or the skyline at night. Its luxury was that no one mocked her in it. No one controlled the thermostat and called it leadership. No one turned her work into a joke. She furnished it gradually over 8 months, one delivery at a time, always under her maiden name. She stocked the closet with clothes she chose for herself, not for Marcus's events. She placed copies of contracts in the office, arranged her monitors, bought a coffee mug from a little bookstore in Hayes Valley, and left it on the desk, like a promise. This was not a hideout. It was an arrival she had not yet announced. The charity gala that changed everything was supposed to be Marcus's triumph. It was held at their Palo Alto mansion, though officially it benefited a foundation supporting digital education. Marcus loved events like that because they allowed him to appear generous while keeping himself at the center. The driveway filled with black cars. Caterers moved through the kitchen. Florists transformed the terrace. Photographers took pictures of donors beneath warm lights. Elena had reviewed the guest list, corrected 3 seating problems, and quietly made sure a major investor's recently widowed mother had a comfortable place away from the music. Marcus did not know any of that. He only knew the evening looked flawless, and because it looked flawless, he assumed the credit belonged to him. Early in the night, Marcus was in a good mood, which meant everyone else was allowed to relax. He spoke about innovation and responsibility, about giving young people tools for the future, about how technology could democratize opportunity. Elena stood beside him, listening to a man who had made opportunity sound noble, while denying dignity inside his own home. When guests approached, she greeted them warmly. She asked about their children, their companies, their recoveries from illnesses Marcus had already forgotten. Several people seemed genuinely happy to see her. A few lingered longer than usual, perhaps because there was a steadiness in her that night they could not name. Elena was calm, but not in the old way. The old calm had been survival. This calm had an exit behind it. As the evening moved toward dinner, Marcus started drinking more than he should have. Alcohol did not create his cruelty, it only removed the decorative wrapping. At first, the comments were familiar. He joked that Elena deserved an award for pretending to understand his speeches. He said she made philanthropy look good because she certainly was not coding anything. People chuckled, but the laughter was thinner than usual. There are moments when a room senses a line approaching before the person crossing it does. Elena felt that shift. She could have rescued him as she had rescued him so many times before by changing the subject, touching his arm or offering a graceful remark that turned cruelty into harmless banter. This time she did nothing. Marcus noticed. Men like Marcus often become angriest, not when they are challenged, but when their usual control stops working. Elena's silence was different that night, and some part of him felt it. Instead of stepping back, he pushed harder. At the main table, surrounded by investors, board members, donors, and old friends who had confused access with loyalty, Marcus raised his voice and pointed toward his wife. He said that if he divorced Elena, she would be applying for a cleaning job within a week. A few people stared at their plates. Someone gave a brittle laugh. Someone else whispered Marcus's name in warning. But Marcus, warmed by wine and ego, mistook discomfort for suspense. He looked at Elena, expecting the familiar smile that would make the insult safe. Elena did not smile. It was such a small refusal, but in that room it felt enormous. Her face remained calm, not dramatic, not wounded for display, just finished. Marcus's expression hardened. He leaned back as if generosity itself had been insulted. Then, in a voice cold enough to make the table go quiet, he said that if she was unhappy, the door was right there, and she was free to leave. He expected her to lower her eyes. He expected her to understand that he had offered freedom only because he believed she had no way to take it. He expected the old pattern, insult, silence, apology without apology, another morning in the same house. Elena looked at him for a moment, and in that moment she did not see a husband. She saw a door opening from the inside. She did not argue. She did not cry. She did not explain to the guests what they had just witnessed. Explanation would have turned the moment into a debate, and Elena had outgrown debates with people invested in misunderstanding her. She simply stood, placed her napkin beside her plate, and walked toward the staircase. The room remained unnaturally still behind her. Marcus gave a short laugh, the kind men use when they are trying to prove they are not afraid. He told the table she needed a moment. He said she was emotional. He said marriage required patience, and several people who had just watched him humiliate her looked down as if their silverware required study. Upstairs, Elena entered the bedroom, closed the door, and let herself breathe once. The suitcases were already packed. One held clothes, documents, and a small velvet box containing the earrings she had worn on the day she married Marcus. Not because she wanted them, but because she wanted to decide later what to do with the memory. The other held files, backup drives, and a framed photograph of her father, who had died before Sterling Systems became famous. He had been the first person to teach her that calm was not the same as fear. On the dresser lay the sealed envelope her attorney had prepared. Elena had imagined many possible endings. She had imagined leaving after breakfast, or during one of Marcus's business trips, or quietly on a weekday afternoon when the house was empty. She had not planned on leaving during a gala, but she had planned enough that when the moment came, it could not trap her. 20 minutes after she left the table, Elena came down the staircase with a suitcase in each hand. The conversation died before she reached the foyer. Guests turned. A server stopped near the doorway. Marcus stared at her, and for the first time that night, the performance drained from his face. Elena crossed the room slowly, not because she wanted drama, but because she refused to rush through her own exit. She placed the thick envelope on the table in front of Marcus. Inside were divorce papers, a notice directing all communication through her attorney, and copies of documents confirming that she was leaving without touching his accounts, his company, or the assets he had once guarded so aggressively. She looked at him one last time and thanked him for finally saying the words she had been waiting to hear for years. That sentence did what anger could not have done. It made Marcus understand for one flickering second that he had not started something, he had completed something. But his pride moved faster than his understanding. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair back, and told her not to embarrass herself. Elena did not answer. She had already spent years answering him in ways he refused to hear. She took the handles of her suitcases and walked toward the front door. No one stopped her. Several guests stepped aside. One older woman near the hall pressed a hand to her mouth. Priya, the founder Marcus had humiliated years earlier, happened to be standing near the terrace doors, invited now as the CEO of her own growing company. She watched Elena pass with tears in her eyes, not because Elena looked broken, but because she did not. Outside, the night air felt cooler than Elena expected. The valet, a young man who had witnessed enough wealthy cruelty to recognize when silence needed respect, brought her car without asking questions. Behind her, the mansion glowed with party lights, music still faintly moving through the walls, as if the house were trying to pretend nothing had happened. Elena loaded her suitcases herself. For a moment, she stood beside the driver's door and looked back at the place where she had spent years becoming smaller in rooms large enough to hold hundreds of people. Then she got in and drove away. She did not speed. She did not sob. She drove with both hands on the wheel north toward San Francisco, while Marcus remained in a room full of witnesses trying to turn abandonment into another joke. Marcus told himself she would come back before midnight. When midnight passed, he told himself she was at a hotel. When the party finally collapsed into awkward goodbyes, he told himself she had gone to a friend who would talk sense into her by morning. He walked through the house, irritated, not frightened. He saw the missing suitcases in the closet and called it theatrics. He saw the empty space where her laptop had been and called it childish. He poured another drink, opened the envelope again, and stared at the legal language as if arrogance could make it disappear. The divorce papers were real. The attorney's name was real. The date on the documents showed they had been prepared weeks earlier. Marcus noticed that detail and felt something unpleasant move through him. He pushed it away. Elena was dependent on him. She had to be. Elena did not go to a hotel. She did not drive to a friend's guest room. She did not sit in a parking lot wondering what to do next. She drove to the San Francisco penthouse she had leased 8 months earlier, entered the private garage with a code Marcus did not know, and took the elevator upstairs. When she opened the door, the apartment was quiet in a way that felt almost sacred. The lights came on softly. Her desk waited by the window. Her contracts were arranged in labeled folders. Her clothes hung in the closet. There was almond milk in the refrigerator, clean sheets on the bed, and a calendar on the wall with meetings already scheduled for Monday morning. A life existed here, not a fantasy life, not an emergency shelter. A life she had built piece by piece while Marcus slept. Only when the door closed behind her did Elena allow herself to cry. Not loudly, not with the collapse Marcus might have imagined. She cried the way people cry when their body finally understands it is safe enough to stop holding itself together. She sat on the floor beside the suitcases and let the tears come for the woman she had been, the years she had lost the younger version of herself, who had once believed love could survive disrespect if she worked hard enough to translate it. Then she stood, washed her face, plugged in her phone, and watched the messages begin. Marcus's first message was angry. The second was mocking. The third told her to stop being dramatic because she would crawl back soon enough. Elena read it, turned the phone off, and made herself a cup of tea. The next morning she woke before sunrise without an alarm. For years, that hour had belonged to secrecy. Now it belonged to her. She opened the curtains and watched fog pull itself between buildings. She made coffee in her own kitchen, wearing a sweater Marcus had never seen, and sat at her desk as Elena Vance, founder and managing partner of Vance Tech Solutions. Her inbox was full, not with apologies, but with work. A hospital network wanted final revisions on a security implementation proposal. A logistics client needed a risk assessment before a board meeting. Her accountant had sent quarterly projections. Her attorney had confirmed receipt of the divorce filing. Each email was ordinary, practical, and stabilizing. Elena read them slowly, feeling something stronger than excitement. She felt continuity. The life she had hidden did not begin after Marcus. It had been waiting for her to step into it openly. Marcus, meanwhile, began the day with performance. He told his assistant Elena had overreacted. He told a board member they were handling a private matter. He told himself the same thing every time his phone stayed silent. But by afternoon, the story had already started moving through the circles he cared about. Not because Elena spread it. She had no need to. People had seen enough. Guests repeated what Marcus had said, adding their own discomfort in whispers. Some claimed they had always known he was cruel. Others acted shocked because pretending surprise is easier than admitting complicity. A few reached out to Elena, but she did not answer most of them. She was not interested in becoming the center of a gossip cycle. She had spent too long being discussed by people who had not protected her. The divorce did not unfold the way Marcus expected. He assumed money would bring her back to the table. But Elena's attorney responded with precision, not emotion. Elena wanted no claim on Sterling Systems. She wanted no public fight over the mansion. She wanted the personal belongings she had already taken a fair division of what the law required and the clean enforcement of the agreement Marcus himself had designed. At first, Marcus laughed at that. Then his lawyers explained what it meant. Elena's company investment accounts and properties had been built through separate income, cleanly documented, protected by the same prenuptial structure Marcus had once considered proof of his superiority. He had guarded his fortune so tightly that he had accidentally guarded hers too. For a man like Marcus, irony was unbearable when it worked against him. Still, he refused to believe the scale of it. In his mind, Elena might have done a little consulting, perhaps enough to rent a modest apartment and pretend independence for a few months. He imagined her pride fading as bills arrived. He imagined her calling when she realized how expensive freedom was. But the calls did not come. Weeks passed. Elena attended meetings, signed contracts, paid her team, and moved through her days with the quiet intensity of someone no longer wasting energy surviving humiliation. Vance Tech Solutions announced a major expansion of its advisory practice. A business journal mentioned Elena Vance as the founder of a rising software consulting firm known for rescuing complex implementation projects. The article included a photograph. Marcus saw it on his tablet while sitting alone in the dining room where he had once mocked her. For several seconds he did not blink. He told himself the article exaggerated. He told himself she had used his connections. He told himself the company must be small, fragile, dependent on one or two clients who would leave once they understood who she really was. But the deeper he looked, the worse he felt. Vance Tech Solutions had case studies going back years. Some client names were confidential, but the available record showed steady growth, disciplined hiring, and contracts Marcus could not explain away. He recognized one healthcare group that had recently reduced its work with Sterling Systems. He recognized a logistics company whose CEO had stopped returning his calls. He recognized the boutique firm praised at dinner months earlier and remembered Elena lowering her eyes to her plate. At the time, he had thought she was embarrassed. Now he realized she had been protecting him from a truth he was too arrogant to survive. Marcus did what powerful men often do when reality refuses to flatter them. He hired someone to investigate it. The private investigator came recommended by an attorney who specialized in delicate matters for wealthy clients. Marcus gave instructions wrapped in contempt. He wanted to know where Elena lived, who funded her company, whether she was seeing someone, whether she was in debt, whether she was preparing to crawl back while pretending otherwise. He expected the report to restore the story he preferred. He imagined pages of evidence proving that Elena's independence was decorative, temporary, maybe even fraudulent. He wanted facts, but only the kind that would return him to power. That is another mistake arrogant people make. They ask for the truth because they assume the truth works for them. The report arrived 3 weeks later. Marcus opened it in his office after sending everyone away. The first section listed Elena's residence, a penthouse in San Francisco, leased months before the gala. The second listed Vance Tech Solutions, its corporate filings, its revenue range, its known clients, its office lease, and its hiring growth. The third listed real estate holdings connected to Elena's separate entities, all acquired through documented business income. The fourth summarized public records showing investments, tax compliance, and professional relationships that had nothing to do with Marcus. There was no secret lover funding her, no hidden debt, no desperate hotel stay, no evidence of collapse. At the end of the report, the investigator had written one clean conclusion. Elena Sterling did not leave impulsively. Under the name Elena Vance, she had been preparing for this departure for a very long time. Marcus read that sentence again and again until the words seemed to detach from the page. Preparing for this departure for a very long time. He thought of the nights she had gone upstairs early, the mornings when she looked tired and he accused her of laziness, the packages addressed to E. Vance, the old laptop, the calm expression at the gala, the suitcases, the envelope. None of it had been sudden. That was what wounded him most. Not that she had left, but that she had lived a whole disciplined life beneath his contempt, and he had never been important enough to notice. He had assumed she was orbiting him. In truth, she had been building gravity somewhere else. After that, Marcus's confidence began to turn brittle. He still wore expensive suits. He still appeared on panels. He still spoke in the polished language of innovation. But people who knew how to listen could hear the strain. His jokes became sharper, less charming. His impatience with employees became more visible. Without Elena beside him at events, he lost the person who had translated his arrogance into something socially survivable. He forgot names. He missed personal details. He offended a donor whose support he needed. He snapped at a client's chief technology officer during a meeting and later learned that Elena had once calmed the same woman through a disastrous transition at another firm. The world did not punish Marcus all at once. It simply stopped cushioning him. Sterling Systems had deeper problems too, the kind Elena had once seen before Marcus did. The company had grown around his personality. Senior managers had learned to tell him what sounded impressive instead of what was true. Product delays were hidden until they became emergencies. Client success teams were understaffed because Marcus preferred funding sales campaigns over support. Engineers were exhausted from promises made on stages before anyone had built the features. Elena had warned him about that pattern years earlier. He had told her not to lecture him about things she did not understand. Now, without her quiet interventions, the pattern became expensive. A hospital client delayed renewal. A financial services contract moved to review. 2 respected engineers resigned within the same month. Marcus called them ungrateful. The board called it a trend. Elena did not celebrate any of this. That surprised people who expected revenge to look louder. She did not post cryptic messages. She did not leak documents. She did not use interviews to describe the marriage. When journalists asked about her personal story, she redirected toward her company's work, her team, and the importance of building systems that did not depend on fear. Those who knew enough could hear the meaning beneath the words, but she never turned pain into spectacle. Her dignity frustrated Marcus more than any attack could have. If she had attacked him, he could have called her bitter. If she had begged, he could have called her weak. But Elena simply became unavailable to the version of the story he wanted to tell. Her company grew because it deserved to grow. Vance Tech Solutions hired carefully choosing people who valued clarity over ego. Elena created a rule that no employee would be humiliated for asking a question, and she enforced it even with clients. She built weekly review practices that caught problems early. She insisted on written scope, honest timelines, and no heroic promises that required exhausted people to quietly suffer. Some clients found her style almost startling after years of vendors who overpromised and disappeared. Her proposals were not flashy, but they were trusted. In a market full of noise, trust became its own kind of power. When Vance Tech Solutions won a major contract to modernize internal systems for a regional healthcare network, the same business publications that had once printed Marcus's quotes began asking Elena for interviews. The first major panel Elena agreed to attend was held in San Francisco at a technology leadership summit. The topic was not marriage wealth or scandal. It was resilient infrastructure in high-pressure organizations. Elena wore a simple navy suit, no dramatic jewelry, no attempt to look like a woman reinventing herself for public consumption. She looked like what she had become, a founder who had earned her seat. In the audience were investors, executives, engineers, and a few people from Marcus's world who had come partly out of curiosity. Elena spoke calmly about the danger of building companies around unchecked charisma. She explained that a leader's job was not to be the loudest person in the room, but to make reality easier for the room to face. No one needed her to mention Marcus. Everyone who knew him felt the reference anyway. A clip from that panel circulated widely, not because Elena exposed anything, but because she said something people recognized as true. She said that systems fail when the people closest to the truth are trained to stay quiet. That sentence traveled. Employees shared it. Founders quoted it. A leadership newsletter highlighted it. Someone at Sterling Systems forwarded it internally, and within hours, Marcus saw it in 3 separate message threads. He watched the clip alone, jaw tight, as Elena spoke with the same intelligence he had spent years denying. She was not angry. She was not pleading to be believed. She was simply undeniable. That, more than anything, made him feel small. Marcus tried apologizing after that. At first, his apologies were not really apologies. They were attempts to reopen access. He left voicemails saying they needed to talk like adults. He sent messages reminding her of their history, carefully selecting the early good years while ignoring what came after. He claimed he had been under pressure. He claimed the jokes had been misunderstood. He claimed people were trying to turn them against each other, as if the witnesses at the gala had invented his words. Elena did not respond. Her attorney reminded his attorney that personal contact should stop. Marcus hated that. He had once believed he could summon Elena with a tone. Now, even his regret had to stand outside a legal boundary and knock. As months passed, the social order around them shifted in ways Marcus had not expected. Some people who once laughed at his jokes began courting Elena's approval. Priya invited Elena to speak at a founder dinner for women building technical companies without inherited networks. An investor Marcus had known for years asked Elena to advise a portfolio company quietly struggling with implementation failures. A philanthropic board removed Marcus from a high-visibility role after several donors expressed concern about his behavior at the gala. No one said the gala was the only reason. People in elite circles prefer language like optics alignment and values. But Marcus understood. The same public image he had used Elena to polish had become cracked by the way he treated her in public. He had not been exposed by a smear campaign. He had been exposed by witnesses remembering accurately. His company's decline was not a dramatic crash at first. It was more humiliating than that. It was a slow loss of inevitability. Sterling Systems still had money, employees, and contracts, but the aura around Marcus weakened. Competitors became bolder. Clients negotiated harder. Employees no longer mistook fear for loyalty. The board began requiring more oversight on major commitments. Marcus responded by becoming more controlling, which made the problem worse. In meetings, he demanded faster results without listening to constraints. In private, he blamed Elena for distracting him, even though she had removed herself completely from his life. That was the final dependence he could not admit. He still needed her as an explanation for his own failure. The clearest reversal came with the Westbridge contract. Westbridge Capital was a powerful investment firm preparing a complicated security modernization across several portfolio companies. Marcus wanted the contract badly. Winning it would reassure the board, calm investors, and prove that Sterling Systems was still a dominant player. For weeks he prepared as if the deal were already his. He knew Westbridge's managing director socially. He had spoken at their retreat. He assumed history and status would do the work. Then he learned that Vance Tech Solutions had been invited to the final round. Marcus laughed when he heard it, but the laugh sounded wrong even to him. He told his team Elena's firm was too small. He told himself Westbridge would never trust a boutique consultancy with something so complex. Yet he could not stop thinking about the investigator's report. The final presentation took place in a glass conference room high above downtown San Francisco. Marcus arrived with a large team, an expensive slide deck, and the old confidence of a man used to entering rooms as the presumed winner. Elena arrived with 2 senior consultants, a concise technical plan, and no visible reaction when she saw him. For a moment, Marcus tried to make the room feel personal. He greeted her with forced warmth, using her married name in a tone meant to remind everyone of their connection. Elena corrected the record gently through her introduction, using Elena Vance without emphasis. The Westbridge executives noticed. Marcus noticed them noticing. His smile tightened. Sterling Systems presented first. Marcus spoke beautifully because speaking beautifully had always been one of his gifts. He promised speed, scale, proprietary frameworks, executive dashboards, and strategic transformation. He used phrases that sounded expensive, but when Westbridge's technical team asked for implementation specifics, his answers became broad. When they asked about staffing continuity, he redirected toward leadership oversight. When they asked about migration risk across companies with different compliance needs, he assured them his people had handled complexity before. Elena listened without expression. She had heard Marcus sell confidence in place of detail for years. In the past, she had often filled the gaps before clients noticed. This time, she held her pen and let the gaps remain visible. Then Vance Tech Solutions presented. Elena did not try to outperform Marcus theatrically. She walked Westbridge through the risks in plain language. She named the places where the project could fail if executives rushed discovery. She explained phased implementation, stakeholder mapping, data governance, and employee training without making anyone in the room feel ignorant. Her team answered technical questions cleanly. When she did not know a minor detail, she said so and explained how they would verify it. That honesty changed the room. Marcus watched Westbridge's CTO lean forward. He watched the managing director take notes. He watched the certainty he had carried into the building begin to leave through someone else's eyes. During the final question period, Marcus made the mistake that sealed the day. He suggested, with a smile almost everyone could read, that Elena's methodology seemed familiar and that smaller firms sometimes learned by observing larger ones. It was not a direct accusation, but it was close enough. For a second, the room went quiet in the same way the gala had gone quiet. Elena could have defended herself. She did not need to. Westbridge's CTO opened a folder and stated calmly that Vance Tech Solutions had provided a pilot framework for one of their portfolio companies nearly 3 years earlier, long before this request for proposals and long before the divorce became public. That pilot, the CTO explained, was one reason Vance had been invited. The methodology was documented, dated, and independently validated. Marcus sat back slowly. His insult had opened a door, and the truth had walked through it. Westbridge awarded the contract to Vance Tech Solutions 2 weeks later. The announcement did not mention Marcus. That made it worse for him. Public defeat can sometimes be turned into a story, but being made irrelevant is harder to spin. Elena sent a brief note to her team, thanking them for disciplined work and reminding them that trust had to be earned again at every stage. Marcus fired 2 executives, blamed the proposal team, and accused the board of undermining him. The board, increasingly tired of his volatility, began discussing leadership transition scenarios. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus faced a possibility he could not charm away. The company might survive better without him. Elena's personal life healed more quietly than her public life rose. Healing for her did not look like constant triumph. It looked like mornings without dread. It looked like eating dinner at her own table without monitoring another person's mood. It looked like leaving a meeting tired but respected. It looked like sleeping through the night because no one would wake her with contempt disguised as conversation. She reconnected with friends she had slowly stopped seeing because Marcus disliked anyone who remembered her before him. She visited her father's grave and told him, not in words exactly, but in the private language of grief, that she had found her way back to the woman he raised. She took off her wedding ring and placed it in a drawer, not as an act of hatred, but as a record of something finished. There were lonely nights, too, and the story would be dishonest without them. Freedom does not erase grief the moment the door closes. Elena sometimes missed the early Marcus, the one who had listened with the notebook open, the one who had once brought her soup when she worked through a fever, the one who had looked at her as if they were building something together. But she learned to separate missing a memory from returning to harm. She learned that love for who someone used to be cannot require you to keep bleeding for who they chose to become. On those nights, she did not text him. She made tea, opened her laptop, reviewed her team's work, or stood by the window until the feeling passed. Each time she did not go back, the old pull weakened. Marcus's apologies eventually became more sincere, but sincerity arrived too late to be useful. That was another consequence he struggled to understand. He believed realization should create restoration. He believed that because he finally felt pain, Elena should return to comfort him through it. He sent a long email one night after another difficult board meeting. This time, he did not joke. He admitted he had humiliated her. He admitted he had taken credit for things she had done. He admitted he had turned her silence into permission because it was easier than respecting her. The email might have mattered years earlier. It might have opened a conversation if it had arrived before the gala, before the suitcases, before the penthouse, before the investigators' report, before Elena learned how peaceful life could be without waiting for him to become kind again. She read it once and did not answer. One afternoon, almost a year after the gala, Elena returned to Palo Alto for a foundation event honoring leaders in technology education. This time, she was not there as Marcus Sterling's wife. She was there because Vance Tech Solutions had funded a scholarship program for young women entering systems engineering and cybersecurity. The event was held not at Marcus's mansion, but at a university hall filled with students, teachers, founders, and donors. Elena spoke briefly about access, mentorship, and the quiet talent that gets overlooked when confidence is mistaken for competence. In the audience, several young women listened with the fierce attention of people hearing a door unlock. Elena saw them and felt the night of the gala loosen its final grip on her. The same field Marcus had used to make her feel invisible and become the place where she could make others visible. Marcus attended that event, though he had not been invited as a speaker. He stood near the back, thinner than before, his confidence worn down around the edges. Some people greeted him politely. Fewer approached than once would have. He watched Elena step off the stage to applause that had nothing to do with his name. She did not look in his direction at first. When she finally saw him, she gave a small nod. Not warm, not cruel, simply civil. That nod hurt more than anger would have. Anger would have meant he still occupied space in her emotional center. Civility meant he had become part of the past, something acknowledged because it had existed, not because it still had power. Later that evening, Marcus sent the message that would become the last personal question Elena ever answered from him. He asked whether she was truly happy without him. Elena saw the message after returning to her apartment. She had spent the evening with scholarship recipients, listened to their questions, laughed with Priya over dinner, and come home to a quiet room filled with things she had chosen. She stood by the window with the city below her, remembering the woman who had once sat on a bathroom floor, trying not to cry too loudly after being mocked at her own table. Then she typed one word: yes. She sent it, and there was no bitterness in the word. That was what made it final. It was not a weapon. It was the truth. Marcus stared at that single word for a long time. He had received complex reports, legal documents, board memos, market analyses, and investor letters. None of them had been as devastating as those 3 letters. Yes meant she was not punishing him by staying away. Yes meant her freedom was not a performance. Yes meant the life he thought she could not survive without him had become better in his absence. And somewhere beneath the humiliation, beneath the professional decline, beneath the panic of a man losing control, Marcus finally understood the simplest truth of their marriage. Elena had not been the dependent one. He had depended on her patience, her emotional labor, her social grace, her intelligence, her ability to absorb insult and still keep his world polished. He had mistaken her restraint for need, because admitting his need would have threatened the story he told about himself. The final separation was not dramatic. The divorce was completed. Elena restored Vance as her legal name. Marcus eventually stepped down as CEO under language that made the transition sound mutual. Sterling Systems continued under new leadership, smaller but steadier, proving in a way Marcus could not avoid that no one person was as irreplaceable as he had claimed to be. He remained wealthy, but wealth had never been the thing he feared losing most. What he lost was the unquestioned admiration that had once wrapped around him like armor. He lost the woman who had known his best self and stayed long enough to see him betray it. He lost the privilege of being forgiven by someone he had trained himself to underestimate. Elena did not build her new life around his downfall. That was the part people often misunderstood when they told the story later. They wanted revenge, because revenge is easy to summarize. But Elena's victory was not that Marcus suffered. Her victory was that his suffering no longer organized her days. She built a company with her name on the door. She created work that respected both clients and employees. She funded scholarships for girls who reminded her of the young woman she had been before marriage taught her to measure her words. She bought fresh flowers for her apartment simply because she liked them, not because guests were coming. She learned the pleasure of leaving her phone unanswered. She learned that peace can feel unfamiliar at first when chaos has been mistaken for love. Years later, people still repeated the story of the gala. Some told it as a scandal. Some told it as a business world reversal. Some focused on the suitcases, the divorce papers, the penthouse, the private investigator's report, or the Westbridge contract. But the people who understood the story best knew that the real turning point had happened long before Elena walked down the staircase. It happened at 2 in the morning, and then again at 3, and then again at 4 on all the nights she chose preparation over despair. It happened every time she opened the laptop Marcus mocked and used it to build what he could not see. It happened every time she refused to become the helpless woman he described. The exit was public. The strength was private. That is the truth Marcus learned too late. Silence is not always weakness. Sometimes silence is a person gathering documents, saving passwords, signing contracts, learning the law, paying taxes, building income, and rehearsing calm until the day calm becomes action. Sometimes the person who says the least is the one who has understood everything. Marcus thought Elena's silence meant she had accepted her place beneath him. In reality, she was refusing to waste her future arguing with a man determined not to hear her. She was not waiting for him to change. She was waiting for herself to be ready. And when he finally pointed at the door, believing it was a threat, Elena recognized it as permission. She did not need to destroy him. She only needed to stop holding together the image he had built on top of her dignity. Once she left, the truth did the rest. His arrogance cost him trust. His cruelty cost him respect. His blindness cost him the one person who had seen both his potential and his flaws clearly enough to help him become better if he had ever chosen humility. But he did not choose humility when love offered it quietly. He only recognized its value after it walked away with 2 suitcases and never came back. So if you ever see someone enduring insult with a calm face, be careful before calling them weak. You may be looking at someone who is tired of explaining, someone who has already cried in private, someone who is building a door while everyone else thinks they are trapped in a room. Elena's story is not about revenge. It is about preparation, dignity, and the quiet power of refusing to live forever inside someone else's lie. Marcus believed Elena could not survive without him. In the end, Elena proved something far more painful. She could survive, succeed, and become fully herself. And the person who could not live without the illusion of being needed was Marcus all along. Do you think Elena's silence for all those years was weakness, or was it the smartest thing she could have done? Leave your thoughts below. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories about people who are underestimated, humiliated, and quietly rising while no one is watching, then stay with this channel for the next one. The whole county expected Marcus Williams to be thrown off the Carter porch that morning. In that part of the South at the beginning of the 20th century, a poor black man did not walk up the long road to a wealthy white landowner's house and ask for the hand of his only daughter. He did not step past the white columns, remove his hat, stand beneath the gaze of portraits and family silver, and speak of love as if love alone could survive the weight of law, custom, gossip, and fear. Men had been beaten for less. Families had been ruined for less. And everyone who saw Marcus walking toward the Carter house that morning believed they already knew how the story would end. They thought Richard Carter would shame him. They thought he would call for the overseer, or reach for the rifle kept inside the front hall, or tell Marcus that a man with no land, no money, and no name that mattered in the courthouse had no right to even imagine a future with Emily Carter. Some expected anger. Some wanted it. A few had gathered near the fence line, pretending to mend harnesses, pretending to check the road, pretending not to watch. But they were watching. In a county like that, a man's humiliation could become entertainment before breakfast. Marcus knew all of this before he set foot on Carter land. He knew the shape of the world he lived in. He had learned it in stores, where his coins were taken slowly, in fields where his labor was praised only when his back was bent, and in churches where men spoke of mercy on Sunday morning and practiced cruelty by Monday noon. He knew that being honest did not always protect a man. He knew that working hard did not always lift a man. And he knew that asking for Emily Carter might cost him more than pride. But he went anyway. He went in the only suit he owned, a dark coat brushed so carefully the worn elbows almost looked intentional. His boots were polished, though the leather had cracked in places no polish could hide. His hands were clean, but they were the hands of a working man, thick at the knuckles, scarred across the palms, with the kind of strength that came from carrying sacks, setting fence posts, pulling calves from mud, and turning poor soil into something that could still feed a family. Marcus did not look like wealth. He did not look like power. He looked like labor, patience, and quiet endurance. That was all he had, and somehow it was enough to keep him standing. For 10 years, Marcus had worked across the county wherever honest work could be found. He had repaired barns for men who would not invite him through their front doors. He had harvested cotton, mended wagons, cleared storm-fallen trees, nursed sick horses, and once spent 3 nights helping an old widow rebuild her smokehouse after a fire, though she had only been able to pay him with cornmeal and 2 jars of preserves. People who disliked him still trusted him with their keys. Men who would not sit beside him in public still sent for him when a roof needed saving before the rain came. That was the strange, bitter arithmetic of Marcus's life. Prejudice could deny his dignity, but it could not deny his usefulness. Emily Carter had seen more than his usefulness. She had first noticed him years earlier, not in any grand moment, but in a small one. A farmhand had dropped a purse outside the general store, and Marcus had picked it up before anyone else saw it. There was money inside, enough to change a month for a man like him. He did not count it. He did not slip it into his coat. He carried it back to its owner, and when the man took it without thanks, Marcus simply nodded and went on with his day. Emily had been standing in the doorway with a parcel of cloth in her arms, and she remembered the calm on Marcus's face more than the insult. There are people who do the right thing loudly because they want witnesses. Marcus did it as if goodness was not a performance, but a habit. Over time, Emily saw that same habit again and again. She saw him help a boy lift a broken wheel from a ditch while other men laughed. She saw him leave extra firewood near the cabin of a sick woman who had once crossed the street to avoid him. She saw him stand still under insult without becoming small inside. And slowly, in the quiet spaces between a divided world's rules, she began to understand that Marcus Williams possessed something many powerful men around her only pretended to have. He had character. Richard Carter saw it too, though he saw it with the guarded eyes of a father and the cautious mind of a man who knew exactly how cruel the world could be. Richard was not a saint. No honest telling of this story should dress him up as one. He was a wealthy white landowner in a time and place built to reward men like him, and he had benefited from customs that pressed hard on people like Marcus. But Richard was not blind, and he was not simple. Age had made him quieter. Loss had made him deeper. Emily's mother had died when Emily was young, and Richard had spent years learning that wealth could fill barns and bank books, but it could not tuck a child into bed with tenderness. It could not teach kindness. It could not buy a conscience after a man had neglected to grow one. So when Marcus stood in his parlor and said with visible fear but steady respect that he loved Emily and wished to spend his life with her, Richard did not explode the way everyone expected. He looked at Marcus for a long time. He looked at the worn suit. He looked at the scarred hands. He looked at the man standing before him with nothing to hide behind. Outside, the county held its breath. Inside, Emily stood near the window, pale but upright, knowing that the next few minutes might decide the rest of her life. Then Richard Carter said the words no one forgot. "My daughter needs a good man, not a rich one." That sentence moved through the room like a struck bell. It reached the porch. It reached the yard. By sundown, it would reach the store, the mill, the church steps, and every kitchen where people seasoned supper with other people's business. Some repeated it in disbelief. Some repeated it in anger. Some laughed and said Richard Carter had finally lost his mind. But the people who knew Richard best understood that he had not given Marcus permission. Not yet. He had only refused to humiliate him. And with Richard Carter, mercy was often the beginning of a test. He told Marcus that words spoken in a warm room could not prove what kind of man stood behind them. Love was easy to claim when hope was near. Honor was easy to describe when there was a reward waiting at the end of the road. But a husband, Richard said, had to be more than brave in public. He had to be faithful when no one praised him, steady when comfort disappeared, and decent when decency brought him no advantage at all. There was a farm to the east belonging to a young man named Thomas Hale. It sat beyond a strip of pine woods and red clay road, close enough for news to travel, but far enough for suffering to be overlooked. Thomas had inherited poor soil, a weak barn, and more debt than wisdom. His fences were collapsing. His livestock were thin. His wife Hannah was expecting a child, and winter was coming hard. Most people had already decided the Hale farm was finished. A few men, including Richard's nephew Elias Carter, were waiting for it to fail so the land could be bought cheap. Richard told Marcus to go there and help Thomas through the winter. There would be no wage. There would be no promise. Marcus would repair what he could, teach what he knew work, as long as the cold demanded, and when spring came, Richard would decide whether Marcus had proven enough. He made it plain that Marcus might return exhausted, empty-handed, and still hear the word no. There was no contract to protect him, no guarantee, no applause waiting at the end. A lesser man might have called the challenge unfair because it was unfair. Marcus was being asked to give months of his life to a white farmer who might not welcome him, for a father who might still refuse him in a county that already believed he had overstepped by daring to love. He could have said that if Richard truly believed character mattered more than money, then Richard should not ask a poor man to spend a winter without pay. He could have walked away with his dignity and told himself that love should not require a trial. Instead, Marcus lowered his eyes for a moment, not in submission, but in thought. Then he accepted, not because he wanted to impress the men watching from the yard, not because he believed hardship would turn prejudice into kindness overnight, and not even because he thought Richard Carter's test was perfectly just. Marcus accepted because somewhere beneath the fear and insult of it all, he recognized the deeper question. If Thomas Hale's family was truly near ruin, then whether Marcus won Emily or lost her, there was still a family who needed help. There was still a barn that would collapse under snow. There were still animals that would die if no one cared for them. There was still a child about to be born into a house where hope had grown thin. Marcus had lived long enough to know that the right thing did not become wrong simply because no one promised to pay for it. He left for the Hale farm 2 mornings later, carrying a bedroll, a small bundle of clothes, a worn Bible that had belonged to his mother, and a little leather pouch of tools. Emily watched from the Carter porch. She did not run after him. In that time and place, even a woman like Emily could not always move freely without putting others in danger. But before he left, she had tucked a knitted scarf into his bundle, gray wool with one uneven edge where her hands had trembled while making it. Marcus found it only after he was miles down the road. He held it for a moment in the cold air, then wrapped it around his neck and kept walking. The Hale farm looked even worse than the rumors. The house leaned slightly to one side, as if tired of standing. The barn roof had been torn open by wind, leaving dark gaps where rain had soaked the hay. Fence rails sagged along the field line, and in one corner a gate hung from a single hinge, creaking even when there was hardly any breeze. The mule in the lot had ribs showing through a patchy winter coat. 2 cows stood dull-eyed near a trough crusted with ice. The fields were not merely unplowed, they seemed abandoned by belief. Everything about the place carried the same message. The people living there had fought as long as they could, and they were beginning to lose. Thomas Hale met Marcus near the barn with suspicion already written across his face. Thomas was not cruel in the dramatic way men like Elias could be cruel. He was not polished enough for that. His cruelty came from exhaustion, shame, and the ugly lessons the county had taught him about who deserved respect. He was young, but failure had aged him. His hands shook from too much work and not enough sleep. His pride had been bruised until it became defensive. When Marcus explained why he had come, Thomas listened with a hard mouth and tired eyes, and Marcus could feel the insult forming before it was spoken. Thomas did not want help from him. Needing help was bad enough. Needing it from a man Thomas had been taught to look down on felt to him like another kind of defeat. Marcus did not argue. He had learned long ago that some men used argument as a rope. If you grabbed it, they pulled you into the mud and claimed you wanted to fight. So Marcus simply asked where the worst leak was, where the feed was kept, which animals were sick, and how much firewood remained. Thomas answered only because the questions were practical. Shame could resist kindness, but it had a harder time resisting a man already holding a hammer. By the end of the first day, Marcus had patched the largest hole in the barn roof with scrap boards and tar paper, cleared rot from the feed bins, and set the broken gate upright enough to keep the mule from wandering. By the end of the first week, he had repaired the north fence line, cleaned the troughs, boiled linseed oil into a rough treatment for cracked harness leather, and convinced Thomas to separate the sickest cow from the rest before the whole herd weakened. He worked before dawn and after dark. He slept in a corner of the barn under his bedroll, wrapped in Emily's scarf and the smell of hay dust. When Hannah Hale quietly left a cup of coffee near the barn door one morning, Marcus thanked her without making the kindness embarrassing. Hannah was the first person on that farm to truly see him. She was heavily pregnant, with shadows under her eyes, and a way of moving carefully as if the whole house might break if she stepped too hard. She had married Thomas when he still believed the farm could become something. She had watched him borrow to buy seed, borrow again after a flood, borrow again when the mule went lame, and borrow one more time when the roof first gave way. Each debt had been written in a ledger at the supply store, and each ledger entry seemed to grow teeth after it was signed. By the time Marcus arrived, Hannah had stopped asking whether they would lose the farm. She only wondered how long Thomas could keep pretending they would not. The store that held most of Thomas's debt belonged in practice, if not entirely on paper, to Elias Carter. Elias was Richard Carter's nephew, though no one who knew them well mistook blood for likeness. Richard carried authority heavily, like a coat he knew could warm or smother depending on how he wore it. Elias wore authority like a medal. He had pale eyes that seemed always to measure what a person was worth to him, and a smile that arrived without kindness. For years he had expected to inherit influence over the Carter land. Richard had no sons, and Elias had told himself that one day the old man would need a younger male relative to manage the estate. Emily, in his mind, was part of that arrangement, not because he loved her, but because marrying her to a man of his choosing would keep everything properly controlled. Marcus's request had not merely offended Elias, it had frightened him. A man like Elias could tolerate charity when it kept people grateful and beneath him. What he could not tolerate was a challenge to the story that gave him power. If Richard Carter could look at Marcus Williams and see a man of worth, then Elias's whole way of judging people began to tremble. If Emily could love Marcus, then status was not as secure as Elias needed it to be. And if Marcus succeeded at the Hale farm, proving himself through labor, wisdom, and mercy, then Elias would lose more than an argument. He would lose the future he had quietly arranged for himself. So Elias began visiting the Hale farm more often than kindness required. He came in a polished buggy, wearing gloves too clean for a man who claimed to know farming. He spoke to Thomas with a false concern that made every sentence feel like a bill coming due. He reminded Thomas of balances owed, of notes signed, of supplies advanced on credit. He mentioned that a failing farmer should be careful whom he trusted, and that some men offered help only because they wanted something hidden in the house. He did not need to say Marcus's name every time. Men like Elias understood that poison worked best when stirred slowly into ordinary conversation. Marcus heard enough to understand. He also saw enough in the ledger Hannah kept wrapped in cloth behind the flour tin. The numbers were wrong. At first, Marcus only noticed small things. A charge for feed delivered twice, though Thomas remembered only one wagon. A medicine bottle priced higher than the same medicine at a store 2 towns over. Interest added before the agreed date. Nails, lamp, oil sacks of meal, harness straps, all marked in a hand that looked official enough to frighten a tired farmer. Marcus had learned figures from his mother, who had insisted that a poor person needed numbers as much as bread, because numbers were where dishonest men liked to hide knives. He did not accuse anyone, not yet, but he began copying certain entries onto spare scraps of paper when Thomas was not too proud to let him look. That was the first small turn in the winter. Marcus had come to mend fences and roofs, but he began to understand that the farm was not dying only from bad weather. It was being drained. Still, the work had to come first. Cold arrived early that year. Frost silvered the fields before sunrise. The pump handle burned the skin with cold. Marcus's breath hung in the barn like smoke as he rubbed down the mule-checked hooves and mixed warm mash for the weakest cow. He taught Thomas to store tools where they would not rust, to rotate feed before mold spread, to mend a harness before it snapped in the field, and to count supplies weekly instead of guessing by fear. None of these lessons were grand. They would never be praised in a newspaper. But farms are often saved by small disciplines repeated when no one feels inspired. Thomas resisted at first. He hated needing instruction from Marcus. He hated the patience in Marcus's voice, because it left him no excuse to call it arrogance. He hated the fact that Marcus did not mock his mistakes. A proud man can sometimes defend himself against contempt. It is harder to defend himself against help that asks nothing in return. Then, little by little, Thomas began to work beside him. At first he did it in silence, as if silence could protect the last wall of his pride. Then he began asking short questions. How had Marcus known the cow's cough was worse than it sounded? Why should seed be kept off the floor? How could a man tell whether a fence post was rotting below the soil line? Marcus answered without triumph. He never made Thomas feel stupid for learning what he had never been taught. And because Marcus did not use knowledge as a weapon, Thomas slowly stopped treating it like an insult. By late October, the farm no longer looked abandoned. It still looked poor, it still looked fragile, but there was order again. Tools hung in rows, feed was covered, the barn roof no longer opened itself to the sky. The cows had begun to gain weight. A small stack of split wood rose beside the house, and Hannah, who had been counting each log in fear, began to sleep a little deeper. Hope did not return all at once. It came the way dawn comes in winter, pale at first, then slowly enough that people nearly miss it until they can see their own hands again. But Elias saw it too. He arrived one afternoon while Marcus and Thomas were setting a new rail near the east pasture. Elias watched them work together and disliked the sight so much that his smile almost disappeared. He spoke lightly, but the message beneath his words was sharp. Thomas still owed money. Repairs did not erase debt. A man could patch a barn and still lose a farm. Then Elias turned his attention to Marcus and suggested with that smooth cruelty of his that unpaid labor was rarely as pure as it looked. Perhaps Marcus expected gratitude to become a claim. Perhaps he was hoping Richard Carter would mistake sweat for suitability. Perhaps some men should remember where the world had placed them. Thomas said nothing. That silence hurt more than the words. Marcus kept his hands on the fence rail. He did not look at Elias. He knew that if he answered with anger, Elias would call it proof of danger. If he answered with wounded pride, Elias would enjoy the wound. So Marcus lifted the rail into place, drove the nail cleanly, and let the sound of the hammer speak for him. It was not weakness, it was discipline. Some people mistook Marcus's restraint for fear because they had never seen strength that did not need to announce itself. That evening, Thomas came to the barn doorway and stood there for a long time before speaking. He did not apologize in the easy way, because easy apologies were not yet part of him. But he asked Marcus whether the east fence would hold through a storm, and when Marcus said it needed 2 more braces, Thomas picked up a lantern and went with him into the cold. For Thomas Hale, that was the beginning of apology. Not words, work. The storm came 3 nights later. It began as rain, then turned mean with wind. By midnight the house trembled around its nails. The road became red mud under black water. Branches scraped the roof like fingers. In the barn, Marcus woke to the mule kicking at the stall door, frightened by thunder. He calmed the animal, checked the patched roof, and was crossing the yard through sheets of cold rain when he saw Hannah's lamp flare in the window. Thomas burst from the house, half-dressed and wild-eyed. Hannah's labor had started early, too early. The doctor lived miles away, and the road between them had become almost impassable. The nearest midwife was an older woman beyond the creek, but the creek was already rising, and Thomas was so shaken he could barely saddle the mule. Panic had stripped him of usefulness. All the pride he had worn like armor fell away, and beneath it Marcus saw what had been there all along, a young husband terrified of losing his wife and child. Marcus had seen births before. His mother, Ruth Williams, had helped women through labor in cabins, sheds, and one half-flooded church basement when the river rose unexpectedly. As a boy, Marcus had carried boiled water, torn clean cloth, held lanterns, and learned the grave calm required when life entered the world through pain. He was not a doctor. He would never claim to be, but he knew enough to keep a room warm, keep fear from taking command, and recognize when waiting for help might cost too much. He sent Thomas for the midwife, because a man in motion was better than a man collapsing in the doorway. Then Marcus went into the house. For the rest of his life, Thomas would remember what he saw when he returned hours later with the midwife, soaked through and breathless. He would remember the fire built high. He would remember water boiling. He would remember clean sheets warmed near the stove. He would remember Hannah alive, exhausted, and gripping Marcus's hand with the trust of someone who had crossed the edge of terror and found steadiness there. And he would remember the thin, furious cry of a newborn child cutting through the storm like a promise. The baby was small, but breathing. Hannah lived. The midwife later said that without Marcus's calm, without the heat, without the clean cloth, without the way he had kept Hannah from surrendering to panic, the night might have ended differently. Thomas did not answer her. He could not. He sat beside the bed with his face in both hands, shaking in a way he would have been ashamed of the day before. But shame had no place in that room now. His wife was alive. His son was alive, and the man he had doubted, resisted, and silently allowed others to insult had helped carry them through the darkest hour of their lives. After that night, Thomas no longer looked at Marcus as a hired hand, or even as Richard Carter's test. He looked at him as a man. That change did not fix the world outside the Hale farm. Elias still came. Storekeepers still watched Marcus too closely. Men in town still lowered their voices when he passed, then raised them once his back was turned. But inside the borders of that struggling farm, something human had broken through the crust of fear. Thomas began introducing Marcus by name, not by task. Hannah saved coffee for him without hiding it. When the baby cried at night, Marcus sometimes rose before Thomas did, warmed a brick near the stove, wrapped it in cloth, and placed it near the cradle to ease the cold. They named the child Samuel, after Thomas's father, but Hannah often said that his second name should have been Mercy. November hardened into December. Snow came twice, not deep enough to bury the fields, but enough to test every repair Marcus had made. The east fence held. The patched roof held. The barn door, newly rehung, held against a night wind that would have torn the old hinges clean away. Each thing that held became a quiet argument against despair. Marcus and Thomas worked through it together. They hauled deadfall from the woods, split rails, cleaned ditches, and planned spring planting with a seriousness Thomas had not felt in years. Marcus showed him how to mark the better-drained sections for early seed, how to keep written account of what went out and what came in, and how to bargain without letting panic speak first. He also convinced Thomas to take the copied ledger entries to an older clerk in the next town, a man who owed Marcus's mother a kindness from years before and still remembered it. The clerk examined the numbers, frowned, and confirmed what Marcus already suspected. Thomas had been charged beyond the terms he signed, not by accident, not once, repeatedly. That knowledge changed Thomas in a different way. Before, he had believed his failure was entirely his own. Every broken rail had felt like evidence against him. Every debt notice had seemed like proof that he was too foolish to hold what his father left him. But now he saw that his mistakes had been used against him by men waiting to profit from his collapse. Responsibility remained, but shame loosened its grip. There is a difference between admitting you stumbled and believing you deserved to be pushed into the dirt. Marcus warned him not to rush. Elias was not a man to confront without proof strong enough to survive anger. So they kept working. They kept records. They saved receipts. Thomas began making copies of everything. Hannah, who had a neat hand and a sharper mind than anyone had given her credit for, organized the papers in flour sacks marked with bits of thread. Marcus never told them revenge would save the farm. Revenge rarely plows a field, but truth carefully kept can become a fence of its own. Christmas passed quietly. The Hales had little to spare, but Hannah baked a small molasses cake, and Thomas set aside his pride long enough to ask Marcus to eat inside the house. Marcus hesitated before accepting. He knew what such a gesture meant. He also knew what it might cost Thomas if the wrong person heard. But Hannah placed the baby in his arms while she cut the cake, and in that moment, the old rules outside the door seemed smaller than the warmth inside. Marcus thought of Emily that night. He thought of the Carter porch, of Richard's unreadable face, of the gray scarf around his neck now frayed from daily wear. He had received no letters from Emily, and he had sent none, not because there was nothing to say, but because every letter could become a weapon in someone else's hand. Instead, he carried her in the discipline of his days. When he was tired, he remembered that she had trusted him, not only to love her, but to remain himself under pressure. That kind of trust can either burden a man or strengthen him. For Marcus, it did both. By January, the county had begun to talk differently about the Hale place. At first, the talk was mocking. People said Richard Carter had sent Marcus there to learn his place. Then the talk became curious. The barn still stood. The animals looked better. Thomas had not signed away his land. Hannah and the baby had survived the storm. Some said Marcus had been lucky. Some said Thomas had finally learned to work. Some said Richard must be secretly paying for everything. People often invent explanations when the truth threatens their prejudice. It is easier to believe in hidden money than visible character. Elias heard the talk and grew restless. He had expected the winter to break Marcus or expose him. Instead, it was making him dangerous in a way Elias had not foreseen. Marcus was not stirring rebellion. He was not making speeches. He was simply proving through competence and restraint that Elias's contempt had been a lie. And lies that support power do not need to be shouted down to become fragile. Sometimes they only need to be contradicted by one man doing honest work where everyone can see the result. So Elias tried one more pressure. In late January, he sent notice that Thomas's debt would be called early unless a portion was paid within 2 weeks. The demand was dressed in proper language, but its purpose was plain. Elias wanted Thomas frightened enough to sign a transfer of land before spring exposed the farm's recovery. Thomas nearly broke under it. He paced the kitchen until Hannah, pale with anger, laid the ledger papers on the table and reminded him that fear had signed enough things already. Marcus studied the notice and the copies. He saw the trap. If Thomas reacted in panic, Elias would win. If Thomas ignored it, Elias might claim default. So Marcus suggested a third path. Thomas would answer in writing. He would request a full accounting of every charge, every interest entry, every delivery record, and every signature. He would send a copy to Richard Carter because Elias had used the Carter name in several dealings. He would also send a copy to the clerk in the next town. Thomas was afraid, but he did it. For the first time all winter, Elias went quiet. That silence told Marcus the proof mattered. February came with bitter mornings and a few surprising afternoons soft enough to suggest spring waiting beneath the frozen ground. The Hale farm was still poor, but it no longer felt doomed. The soil had been turned where weather allowed. Seed had been sorted. Repairs were finished, not beautifully, but solidly. The livestock had survived. The baby had grown round-cheeked and loud. Thomas had begun standing straighter, not because pride had returned in its old form, but because dignity had taken root where pride had once tried to cover fear. Then, near the end of the month, Richard Carter himself came to the Hale farm. He arrived without Elias. That alone was noticed. Richard walked the property slowly, taking in the repaired fences, the barn roof, the stacked wood, the clean troughs, the marked seed sacks, the ledger copies drying near the stove after Hannah had recopied them. He did not praise Marcus in front of him. Richard was not a man who scattered praise like seed, but his eyes missed very little. Thomas, who had once resented Marcus's presence, now insisted on telling Richard what had happened during the storm. He told it badly because emotion made him clumsy, but the truth inside it was unmistakable. Hannah added what Thomas could not. She described Marcus's calm, the fire, the boiled water, the way he had kept fear from filling the room. She did not make it dramatic. She did not need to. Some truths become more powerful when spoken plainly. Richard listened. Marcus stood near the door with his hat in his hands, uncomfortable with being the subject of gratitude. When Richard finally looked at him, there was something different in the old man's face. Not softness exactly, recognition. But he still said nothing about Emily. That was the hardest part for Marcus. After months of labor, after the storm, after the accusations, after every cold morning when his body had begged him to stay under the blanket a little longer, Richard left without giving him an answer. For a moment, Marcus felt the full weight of the test again. He had never been promised anything. Spring was near, and he still did not know whether the road back to Carterland would lead to joy or heartbreak. That night, Marcus went to the barn and sat on an overturned feed bucket long after the house went quiet. He was tired in a way sleep could not easily mend. His hands ached. His coat had grown looser from hard work and missed meals. He thought of Emily, and for the first time all winter he allowed himself to fear that Richard would still refuse. Not because Marcus had failed, but because the world might be too heavy even for Richard Carter's courage. Then the baby cried from the house. A few moments later, Thomas appeared at the barn door, carrying Samuel wrapped in a blanket. The child quieted when placed in Marcus's arms, staring up with unfocused eyes, as if the whole world were no more complicated than warmth and breath. Thomas stood beside him without speaking for a while. When he finally did, he said in his own awkward way that whatever happened at the Carter farm, the Hale family would never forget who had stood with them when there was nothing to gain. Marcus looked down at the child and understood something he had not expected. The winter had already given him something no one could take back. It had not given him Emily. It had not given him land. It had not given him safety. But it had confirmed the kind of man he wanted to remain, even if the world refused to reward him for it. That did not erase the pain of uncertainty. It simply placed something stronger beside it. By March, the first green began to show along the ditches. Marcus prepared to leave. Thomas tried to delay him by finding more work that needed doing, but they both knew the season had turned. The farm would need Thomas now, not Marcus. The point of help had never been to make Thomas dependent. It had been to help him stand again. Hannah packed Marcus a small bundle of bread, smoked meat, and dried apples for the road. She did it with the solemn care of someone sending family away. Before Marcus left, Thomas handed him an envelope. Inside was money. Not much, but for the Hales it was a sacrifice. Thomas had saved it from small sales from a repaired harness job from 2 debts collected by neighbors who had once assumed he would never recover. His hand shook as he offered it, not from reluctance, but from the fear that Marcus might think the amount too small for what he had done. Marcus looked at the envelope for a long moment. He thought of his own empty pockets. He thought of the months without wages. He thought of the boots he needed, the coat that would not last another winter, the debts of his own life that never appeared in any ledger but were always present. Then he looked through the open door and saw Hannah holding Samuel near the stove, the baby's feet covered in little cloth wrappings because he had no proper shoes, yet not that he could walk, but because mothers dream ahead. Marcus folded Thomas's hand back over the envelope. "Keep it," he said. "Buy that child a good pair of boots when he's ready to walk." It was the kind of sentence that sounded simple until years gave it weight. Thomas tried to protest, but Marcus would not take the money. He accepted the food because refusing kindness can sometimes wound the giver, but he would not accept the wages. He had promised to work without pay. More than that, he knew the Hale family needed every coin for the season ahead. So he left that morning with no money earned, no answer secured, and no visible proof of victory except the farm behind him, still standing. The road back to the Carter place felt longer than the road east had felt in autumn. Marcus walked past fields waking from winter, past cabins with smoke lifting thinly from chimneys. past the store where men paused to stare, past the churchyard where women watched from beneath hat brims. News traveled faster than footsteps, and by the time Marcus reached Carterland, people already knew he was coming. Some came to see whether he had failed. Others came because they had heard strange things about the Hale farm and wanted to see whether Richard Carter would honor his own test. Elias came because he believed he could still turn the ending. Richard had arranged for Marcus to meet him in the front parlor, the same room where the challenge began. This time the room was not empty. Emily stood near her father's chair. Elias stood by the mantel with his arms crossed, looking pleased in a way that warned Marcus before a word was spoken. 2 neighbors were there as witnesses, along with the minister from the small church near Carter's western field. Richard sat stiffly older than he had looked in autumn, his cane resting across his knees. Marcus removed his hat. He expected questions about the work. He expected Richard to ask how many fences had been repaired, how many animals saved, how much debt remained, how Thomas had managed the supplies. He had answers ready, because work leaves facts behind. But before Richard spoke, Elias stepped forward. Elias had prepared his moment carefully. Men like him often confuse preparation with truth. He spoke of impropriety, of danger, of reputation, of how the county was laughing at Richard Carter. He suggested that Marcus had manipulated a desperate family to appear noble. He hinted that no man worked months without pay unless he expected a greater prize. Then he claimed there were irregularities in Thomas Hale's accounts and implied Marcus had meddled in matters beyond his place. He did not accuse directly at first. He let suspicion do the work. Suspicion is useful to a coward because it dirties a man without requiring proof. Marcus stood still. Emily's face tightened, but she did not interrupt. Richard did not interrupt either. He let Elias keep speaking, and that patience made Elias bolder. Soon the polished concern dropped away, and the contempt beneath it showed itself. Elias spoke of bloodlines, inheritance, social order, and the disgrace of allowing a man like Marcus to believe he could step into the Carter family. He said Richard's kindness had been mistaken for permission. He said Emily's feelings were youthful foolishness. He said the county needed to see that Carter land would remain in proper hands. By the time Elias finished, he believed he had won. That was when Richard Carter lifted his cane and tapped it once against the floor. The room went silent. Richard said he had known everything, not everything in the mystical sense. Richard was no magician. But through winter he had listened. He had received word from the blacksmith who had sharpened Marcus's tools and refused payment until spring. He had heard from the midwife who crossed the flooded creek and found Marcus keeping Hannah alive with steady hands. He had read Thomas Hale's own letter, written with difficulty and stained where Hannah had likely cried while reading it over. He had sent men quietly along the East Road and asked not whether Marcus looked impressive, but whether the farm was improving, whether the animals were cared for, whether Thomas was learning, whether Marcus complained, whether he asked for wages, whether he used Richard's name as leverage. The answer again and again had been no. Marcus had not boasted. He had not demanded. He had not threatened. He had not used Emily as a reason to be served. He had worked. Then Richard turned to Elias. The second part of the reveal landed harder because Elias had not expected the winter to test him, too. Richard had seen the copies of Thomas Hale's ledger. He had compared the entries with supply records. He had spoken to the clerk in the next town. He had discovered the double charges, the early interest, the inflated medicine, the false delivery notations, and the pressure placed on Thomas to surrender land that Elias had quietly hoped to control. Richard had also learned that Elias had used the Carter name to frighten smaller farmers into agreements Richard himself had never approved. The room changed. Elias tried to speak, but the confidence had drained from his face. He reached for explanations, but explanations are thin things when numbers sit in order on a table. Richard had the papers brought in, not dramatically, not with shouting, but with the calm of a man who understood that truth does not become stronger when yelled. He laid the ledger copies beside Elias's own store records. The columns matched where honesty allowed them to match, and betrayed him where greed had made him careless. For months, Elias had wanted Marcus exposed as a fraud. Instead, the papers exposed Elias as a man who had been trying to profit from another family's collapse while pretending to defend honor. Richard did not ask Marcus to defend himself. He did not need to. The winter had defended him. The repaired farm defended him. Hannah's living child defended him. The refused envelope defended him. Thomas's letter defended him. Every quiet act Marcus had performed without witnesses now seemed to have found its way into the room and taken a seat. Then Richard said the words that explained the whole test. "This was never only about whether you could save a farm," he told Marcus. "I wanted to know what you would do when there was nothing in your hand and nothing promised ahead of you. That is the one place a man cannot pretend to be good for long." No one spoke. Richard's voice was not sentimental. It carried too much iron for that. But beneath the iron was emotion he did not bother hiding anymore. He said that Marcus had proven more than endurance. He had proven restraint under insult, wisdom under pressure, mercy toward a family that had not first offered him respect and honesty when money could have been taken without shame. A rich man could pretend at generosity with coins he would never miss. A poor man refusing needed money so a child could someday have boots was a different kind of testimony. Elias's punishment was not theatrical, but it was complete. Richard removed him from all Carter business that same day. He sent notice to the store that no account using the Carter name would be honored under Elias's authority again. He paid to have Thomas Hale's debt recalculated fairly, not as charity to Thomas, but as correction for fraud done under the shadow of his family name. He informed the farmers tied to Elias's books that they could have their accounts reviewed. Some men in power survive scandal because the world prefers convenience to justice. But Elias had built his influence on borrowed trust. Once Richard withdrew that trust, doors began closing. Elias left the Carter house with the look of a man who had lost something deeper than money. He had lost the protection of being believed. Only then did Richard turn back to Marcus and Emily. He did not pretend the road ahead would be easy. He did not speak as if one winter could soften every cruel custom in the county. He knew that some laws were written against people like them, and some neighbors would use those laws as permission for hatred. He knew people would whisper, refuse invitations, cancel agreements, and call dignity by ugly names, because they feared what it meant. He knew blessing their union would cost him comfort and reputation. But a father who asks a man to prove courage must be careful not to fail courage himself. Richard gave his blessing. Emily crossed the room then, not dramatically, but with a steadiness that seemed to come from months of waiting. She took Marcus's work-worn hand in both of hers. No speech was needed. Everything that mattered had already been said by the winter, by the storm, by the records, by the old man's blessing, and by the fact that Marcus had returned with less than he left carrying, yet somehow stood taller. Richard did not hand Marcus a deed as if land could purchase belonging. He did not give him a bag of money and call it justice. Instead, he offered what Marcus had earned in the only way Marcus would accept. He asked him to manage a portion of the Carter farm for a fair wage with authority over the work and responsibility for its results. It was not charity. It was trust made practical. Marcus accepted because honest work with honest pay was not a favor. It was dignity. The wedding did not look like the weddings sung about in family histories. There were no crowds of smiling neighbors lining the road. There were no long tables overflowing with guests eager to bless the couple. Some people refused to come. Some came only to watch with disapproval. Others stood far off, unwilling to be seen too near the moment, but unable to look away. There were places where paper would not protect Marcus and Emily the way it protected other couples. There were people who insisted that no vow could matter if the county did not approve it. But before God, before Richard, before a few brave witnesses, and before the truth they had both chosen, Marcus and Emily made their promises. Their marriage began under pressure. Customers stopped buying from Carter Land for a time. A merchant refused Emily's service until Richard moved his accounts elsewhere. 2 laborers quit rather than work under Marcus's supervision. A note was left near the west gate one morning, warning Marcus to remember that some men did not like changes in the order of things. Marcus burned the note without showing Emily the worst of it, but she saw enough in his face to know. That night she sat beside him on the porch, and they watched the fields darken, without pretending courage meant the absence of fear. Richard took losses too. Men who had praised his judgment for years suddenly called him reckless. Families who had eaten at his table sent regrets without explanation. The minister who had stood as witness found his sermons less welcomed by those who preferred religion without sacrifice. But Richard had passed an inward point from which he could not return. He had seen Marcus tested and Elias exposed. He had seen the difference between reputation and righteousness. The cost did not surprise him. It only revealed who had been renting space in his life under the name of friendship. Marcus did not answer hatred with speeches. He answered by working. He rose before dawn as he always had, but now he walked the Carter fields not as a temporary hand, not as a man being tested, but as someone responsible for the life of the land and the people depending on it. He changed storage methods, repaired neglected drainage, reorganized feed schedules, and insisted that every worker, black or white, be paid according to work done rather than favor curried. That rule alone angered men who had grown used to privilege covering laziness. Marcus did not enjoy their anger, but he did not bend to it. He also changed how accounts were kept. No one signed a paper they could not read without having it read aloud. No supply charge was entered without a matching delivery note. Workers could see the measure of crop share before settling, not after. These were simple practices, but in a place where confusion had long been profitable, clarity felt almost revolutionary. Some accused Marcus of stirring trouble. Others quietly thanked him because for the first time they knew what they were owed before asking. Emily found her own place in the work. She had been raised in the main house, but marriage to Marcus stripped away any illusion that gentleness could remain decorative. She began teaching reading in an unused storage room near the old smokehouse, first to children, then to grown workers who came at dusk, pretending they were only there to fetch tools. She learned which families needed medicine, which mothers were near exhaustion, which men drank because pain had no other doorway. She did not turn the farm into paradise. No one person can. But she helped make it harder for suffering to hide in plain sight. The Carter Williams name was not accepted by everyone at first. Some said it mockingly, as if joining the names made the whole thing ridiculous. But names have a way of becoming real when attached to daily labor. The farm's records bore Marcus's hand. The store orders bore Emily's. Richard, aging but still watchful, began referring to the eastern fields as Marcus's section, not because Marcus owned them, but because responsibility had a language everyone understood. Over time, even men who disliked him found themselves admitting that yields were better, losses were lower, animals healthier, workers steadier. Success did not erase prejudice. It exposed it. When Carter Williams fields produced strong harvests, some neighbors said Marcus had merely been lucky with weather. When the livestock improved, they said Richard must have hired secret experts. When workers from failing farms asked to be taken on under Marcus, they said people were being spoiled by fair treatment. Every explanation carefully avoided the simplest truth. Marcus Williams knew what he was doing, and he treated people in a way that made them willing to do their best. Thomas Hale became one of Marcus's strongest allies. By the second spring after the winter trial, Thomas's farm had not only survived, it had begun to pay down its corrected debts. He came often to Carter Williams, sometimes for advice, sometimes to trade labor, sometimes simply to sit with Marcus after a long day and say very little. Their friendship was not smooth or sentimental. It had passed through too much discomfort for that. Thomas still had to unlearn the habits the county had planted in him, and Marcus did not pretend history vanished because one man had changed. But trust grew, not as a speech, but as a practice. When Samuel Hale took his first steps, he wore boots bought with the envelope Marcus had refused. Hannah brought the child to the Carter Williams farm that day, laughing as Samuel stumbled across the packed dirt near the barn. The boots were too fine for a farm child, who would outgrow them quickly, but Thomas had bought them anyway. He said a promise had been attached to that money, and some promises deserved leather strong enough to remember. Marcus knelt in the yard, touched one little boot, and for a moment the whole winter came back to him. The storm, the fear, the cold barn, the envelope in Thomas's hand, the long road home. Emily saw his face and understood without asking. Years passed. The county changed slowly, as counties often do, and pride sits heavier than truth. Some hearts softened. Some only learned to keep hatred quieter when it became inconvenient. A few who had mocked Marcus came to him in private when their own farms faltered, asking questions they would once have been ashamed to ask. Marcus helped when he could, but he did not confuse need with repentance. He had learned that forgiveness and foolishness are not the same thing. He could offer guidance without handing dishonest men the power to wound him twice. Elias Carter never recovered the place he believed he deserved. For a while he tried to rebuild his influence through other men's resentment, but resentment is poor soil. It grows quickly and feeds nothing. Once farmers understood how his ledgers had worked, they became slower to sign, slower to trust, quicker to ask for copies. The very people Elias had counted on exploiting became harder to trap because Marcus had taught them where to look. That was the cleanest justice of all. Elias was not merely punished by losing Richard's favor. He was punished by the spread of knowledge. Richard watched all this from the porch as age settled into his bones. He walked the fields less. He leaned on his cane more. His voice, once strong enough to quiet a room, grew thinner, though his eyes remained sharp. In the evenings he often sat with Emily nearby, and Marcus coming in from the fields, boots dusty, hat in hand. Workers stopping him, even after hours, because some question needed answering. Richard would watch Marcus listen. That was what struck him most in old age. Marcus listened before deciding. He listened to men who had no power. He listened to women other managers ignored. He listened to young workers full of mistakes, and because he listened, his authority did not need to be cruel to be obeyed. One autumn evening, years after the winter trial, Richard asked to be driven to the eastern boundary of the farm. The fields there had once been neglected, the soil thin, the fences poor. Under Marcus's management, they had become some of the most productive acres Carter land had ever known. Workers were bringing in the last of the harvest, and the sun hung low enough to turn dust into gold. Richard watched without speaking. He saw black workers and white workers moving under the same foreman's call, not equal in the eyes of the world beyond the fence, but held to a fairer measure within it. He saw Emily speaking with Hannah Hale beside a wagon. He saw Samuel, older now, carrying a water pail too large for him, but refusing help with the stubborn dignity of a child raised among survivors. And he saw Marcus, standing at the center of it all, not as a man who had been given a place, but as a man who had built one. Richard understood then, more deeply than he had understood in the parlor, that he had not merely found a husband for his daughter, he had found a keeper for the best part of what he had once hoped his land could mean. Land by itself is morally silent. It will grow cotton for a cruel man and corn for a kind one. It will feed greed as easily as it feeds children. What gives land meaning is the spirit of the people who govern what happens on it. Under Elias, the Carter name would have become another instrument of pressure. Under Marcus, it had become shelter, discipline, fairness, and possibility. Richard did not live many years beyond that autumn. When he died, the county wondered what would happen. Some assumed the old arrangements would return. Some believed Emily would be pressured into surrendering authority to distant relatives. Some hoped Marcus's influence would fade without Richard sitting on the porch like a weathered guard. But Richard had prepared more carefully than they knew. His papers were in order. Emily's rights were protected as far as the law allowed. Marcus's management contract was strengthened. The land was not handed to greed through silence. At Richard's funeral, attendance became its own kind of confession. Men who had condemned him came because they could not deny his importance. Workers came because they had known his protection imperfect but real. Thomas Hale came with Hannah, and Samuel the boy standing solemnly in boots scuffed by honest use. Elias stood at the edge of the cemetery, older, thinner, still carrying resentment like a coat he could not remove. Marcus stood beside Emily, not behind her, not before her, but beside her. Some people looked away from that sight. Others looked, and for the first time did not look quickly elsewhere. After the burial, Marcus returned to work. Grief did not pause the seasons. Fences still needed checking. Accounts still needed settling. Families still needed wages. The first year after Richard's death tested Carter Williams in ways winter had once tested the Hale farm. There were legal challenges, canceled agreements, whispered threats, and one small fire set near an equipment shed that could have spread if a night watchman had not seen it early. Emily was frightened, though she hated admitting it. Marcus was frightened too. Courage, he often reminded her, was not a feeling. It was a decision, repeated until fear no longer got to choose the road. They endured. Not perfectly, not without cost, but they endured. The farm grew into something people could no longer dismiss as an old man's eccentric choice. It became known for fair weights, clean records, strong animals, repaired housing, and a rule that no worker's child would be turned away from evening lessons. A small fund was set aside for medicine during childbirth, inspired by the night Hannah nearly died. Another fund helped families buy boots before winter, and though Marcus never named it after Samuel, everyone who knew the story understood. A pair of boots had become more than footwear. It had become a promise that children should not inherit only the cold. Marcus and Emily had children of their own. They raised them in a world that did not know what to do with them, children claimed by love, but questioned by law, watched by neighbors who wanted to decide what they were allowed to become. Marcus taught them that dignity could not depend on the comfort of others. Emily taught them that tenderness without courage was too fragile to guide a life. They did not hide the difficulty of their story, but neither did they let difficulty become the whole inheritance. Their children grew up knowing that their parents' life together had been opposed, tested, mocked, and threatened, but also that it had been chosen with clear eyes and kept with steady hands. Years later, when people told the story, some tried to make it simpler than it was. They said Marcus won Richard over by saving a farm. That was true, but not enough. They said he proved himself by working without pay. That was true too, but still not enough. They said Richard was a wise father who valued character above wealth. True again, though wisdom had cost him more than a sentence. The deeper truth was that Marcus had revealed the measure of everyone around him. His goodness did not simply prove that he was worthy. It exposed greed in Elias, fear in Thomas, courage in Emily, conscience in Richard, and hypocrisy in a county that had mistaken custom for morality. That is what true character often does. It does not only shine, it reveals. When Marcus stood in Richard Carter's parlor as a poor man asking for the impossible, people thought the question was whether he was good enough to enter that family. By the end, the question had changed. The winter asked whether the family, the farm, and the people watching from the road were strong enough to recognize goodness when it arrived without wealth, without permission, and without the right color of skin for the world they had built. Some failed that question. Some changed because of it. And Marcus kept walking. He walked into the Hale farm when he was not wanted. He walked through a storm to keep death from taking a mother and child. He walked away from money he needed because a baby's future mattered more than his pride. He walked back to Carterland, not knowing whether love would be granted or denied. He walked into marriage with Emily when the world around them offered more warning than blessing. And for the rest of his life, he walked the fields, not as a man begging to be accepted, but as a man quietly building proof that dignity does not wait for permission. In the end, Richard Carter's famous sentence was only the doorway into the lesson. My daughter needs a good man, not a rich one. But the winter taught the county what that sentence really meant. A good man is not proven by how loudly he speaks of honor when people are listening. He is proven by what he repairs when no one thanks him, what he refuses to take when he has every excuse to take it, how gently he handles the weak, how firmly he stands against the dishonest, and how much of himself he is willing to give when there is no guarantee that life will give anything back. Marcus Williams began with no land, no fortune, and no social power. He had only his hands, his name, and the character his mother had helped build in him before the world tried to break it. From that, he helped save a farm. From that, he earned a father's blessing. From that, he built a marriage strong enough to outlast contempt. From that, he helped turn Carterland into a place where work was measured more fairly. Children learned to read. Debts could no longer hide so easily in dishonest ledgers. And a pair of baby boots became a symbol of mercy remembered. Money can build a house, but it cannot make a home honest. Land can give a man power, but it cannot give him a soul. Status can open doors, but it cannot teach a person what to do once someone helpless is standing on the other side. A good man, even starting with nothing, can build something worth inheriting. But money, land, and reputation can never create a good man where no character lives inside. So here is the question this story leaves behind. Was Richard Carter too harsh for sending Marcus into that winter without a promise? Or was he wise enough to understand that love, courage, and integrity must be proven where applause cannot reach? Share your thoughts below, and if stories about character, justice, love, and quiet strength still matter to you, stay with this channel for the next one.